Okay, good morning, everyone. And thank you for coming to the first of today's sessions on housing and health. I'm Chris Neat, Academic Director of the National Center for Suburban Studies here at Hofstra, where I'm also an Associate Professor in the Sociology Department. I'd like to introduce my colleague, Martine Hackett, who's Associate Professor and Chair in the Department of Population Health, who co-organized these panels and will moderate this afternoon's session on fair and affordable housing. Before we begin, a couple brief thank yous. I'd like to thank Kathleen Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi at the Hofstra Cultural Center for working with us to organize, advertise, and sponsor this event in the midst of an incredibly packed schedule this semester. I'd also like to thank my partners at NCSS, Larry Levy, Deb Tinarello, and Ina Katz for their support in the midst of a similarly packed schedule as they prepare for the annual celebration of suburban diversity, which will take place this year on December 6th, so save the date. The first panel today considers the redevelopment and revisioning of the suburbs, especially in the wake of COVID-19. And when I first arrived at the center, when I first arrived at Hofstra in 2007, the very first event I attended was a 60th anniversary celebration of Levittown, New York. And in the US, Levittown had long served as kind of an archetype for large-scale suburban redevelopment. Its built form, its racial exclusivity, its relationship to suburban governance. And that was a problem. First, because it obscured the tremendous variation among suburbs as they were. Many US suburbs did not resemble Levittown, and suburbs outside the US displayed even more dramatic variations in their form, demographics, governance, and so on. And I would tip my hat here to the Global Suburbanisms Network, led by Jorge, Kyle, and his colleagues, one of whom is with us here today, who really worked mightily to kind of find the common threads at the international level. The second problem, though, with Levittown's status as this archetypical suburb was that this image of what the suburbs were also limited our sense of what they could be. And in the last 14 years, what we've been trying to do with the center and what our panelists have been trying to do is to change the way that we conceive of the suburbs and also the ways that we recreate them. We need to be clear-eyed about the suburbs' role as a site of ongoing racial and class exclusion, of environmental harms, of health inequalities. We also need to seek out new strategies to build and rebuild suburban places that are more socially just and environmentally sustainable. And we also need to find new ways to involve diverse stakeholders in the process of charting those suburban futures. Now, as we think that through, COVID-19 is potentially a massive disruption. It's clear that early alarmist press reports of the abandonment of central cities and a mass flight to the suburbs were overstated. But many of us are still grappling with the scope of the pandemic's effect upon the housing market in the near term and its effects on suburban communities more generally in the long term. These are trends that, all of these trends were, the larger trends of suburban growth, decline, and redevelopment were ones that we were just coming to understand in 2019. And what we thought we had figured out then now seems uncertain to us in 2021. Luckily, we have an excellent panel of speakers to help us make sense of it all. So to begin, we welcome Jorge Gonçalves from Lisbon, who's one of the first cross-Atlantic speakers that I think we've had on our the center's panels since the beginning of the pandemic. He has a PhD in geography and regional planning from the Universidade Nova de Lisboa. He is currently a professor at the Instituto Superior Técnico, University of Lisbon, Portugal. He was coordinator of master's degrees in urban and spatial planning. He's in charge of courses such as human geography, urban governance, and strategic planning. He is part of Situa, the Center for Innovation in Territory, Urbanism, and Architecture, and is also the principal investigator of the project MetroGov 3C, Metro Governance in the Lisbon Metropolitan area in a context of competition, cooperation, and conflict. He has also worked on urban and community development projects, many of them in the Lisbon metropolitan area. Murat Kuglu received his PhD in environmental studies from York University in February 2021. He co-edited the book Massive Suburbanization, Rebuilding the Global Periphery, together with Roger Kyle and K. Murat Gurney, His research interests include the financialization of housing, massive suburbanization in Toronto and Istanbul, and the impact of digital platforms on housing. Willow Lungamam, PhD, is Associate Professor of Urban Studies and Planning at the University of Maryland, College Park, where she also serves as the Director of Community Development at the National Center for Smart Growth Research and Education and Director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. She's written extensively on suburban poverty, racial segregation, immigration, gentrification, redevelopment politics, and neighborhood opportunity. She's the author of Trespassers, Asian Americans in the Battle for Suburbia, and a forthcoming book on redevelopment politics and equitable development organizing in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. David Garton is Senior Vice President for Corporate Communications, ESG, and External Affairs at RXR Realty, one of the largest owners, operators, and developers of real estate and infrastructure in the New York metropolitan area, in the New York metropolitan region. David manages the execution of RXR's thought leadership, media, crisis communications, and overall public affairs strategy. He also oversees RXR's external affairs and ESG initiatives, which includes working with various government entities, civic and mission-driven organizations, as well as the implementation of social impact programs in the communities where the company operates. Prior to his role at RXR, David served as the Chief of Staff to the Vice Chair at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the Director of Federal Relations at the New York Metropolitan Transit Authority, and a senior advisor to former U.S. Senator Hillary Rodham Clinton and the late U.S. Senator Frank Lautenberg in Washington, D.C. Paul Gibson, our last speaker is Paul Gibson, the President of the Board of Directors of the Uniondale Community Land Trust, a nonprofit working to turn the community liability of deteriorated housing into a stock of sustainably affordable owner-occupied homes in the hamlet of Uniondale, located in Nassau County, New York. Paul is pre-retired after a 33-year career at Continental Grain Company, where he served as an officer of the company heading its investment administration and cash management areas. He was also a member of the family office of the company's owner. In addition to his position at UCLT, Paul currently serves on the board of directors of Emblem Health, one of the nation's largest not-for-profit health insurance companies, providing healthcare coverage to approximately 3.1 million members in New York, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. He holds MBA degrees in both finance and marketing from Columbia and a BA from Yale University. We welcome all of our panelists. For the format of the panel, we're going to begin with our comments from each of them, from our presenters from outside of Long Island, and then move to comments from our last two presenters who will focus on suburban development closer to home. Please do feel free to submit your questions to the chat, and once all five speakers have offered initial comments, we'll open the floor for Q&A. And with that, I will pass the virtual mic to our first speaker, Jorge Gonçalves.
Hi to everyone. Thank you for invitation. Chris, it's a pleasure to be here. And it's important to talking about Lisbon, but also it's important to you to have, I suppose, like an idea around what is the metropolitan area of Lisbon. So I don't have a real speech, but I have some topics that I can talking about. And if you want to go more deeply in some of these topics, please tell me, but I can make like a trip around some topics if you want. So the first idea, this is the idea that the Lisbon metropolitan area, it's a very small metropolitan area compared with others. So we have only 3 million people, and the central city, Lisbon, only have 500,000 people. So it's natural, but almost all the people are living in the periphery, in the suburbs. This is the first idea. The second idea, this is important, is the idea that for the normal people, the common people, we have good suburbs and bad suburbs. I suppose this is normally also, but we can call suburbs to some places we cannot call suburbs to other places because the word suburb, it's not a positive word. So for some that living in some areas, it's not good thing to giving this name to their area. So this is the second idea. The other idea that I want to bring to here is the idea that the suburbs of Lisbon are changing in the last 2 or 3 decades after our revolution, because in the past we don't have like a very strong local democracy. So we don't have local governments in the past. And with the start of these, or the beginning of these local governments, the revitalization and qualification of these areas starting, and now we have of course a lot of problems, but the things are very, very best that they are in the past. So we can see some evolution from 3 decades from our revolution. We can go to the problems that we feel today, and some are linked with the COVID pandemics, and others we can see that they coming from more far, if you want. Maybe the main problem that we face in all metropolitan area, it's the lack of housing, for the affordable housing for young people, young couples, for some minorities, etc. So this is the main problem. The second, also related with housing, is even the people that now living in very good conditions, they are very dependent from the bank. So they need to pay every monthly like a large amount of money to pay the mortgage. But and so this is a problem, because when you have some economic waves, economic cycles, these people, these families start to feel also problems. So we have problems with people don't can have access to housing, and also we can have problems with people that normally have a normal housing, but in some conditions, in some economic context, they can start to have problems. And so this is the second dimension of our problem related with housing. The third, it's very connected with this problem of the pandemics, because people in the last 1-2 years needs to stay more in house, and it's easy to everybody understand that some families don't have the right conditions to not only to work from house, from home, but also to live in their homes with the families and working together at the same time. So and this is the one of the most important problem. And we can also find some reasons for these difficulties that we have in related with housing. One, in the access to housing, we have a problem in Portugal now, very connected with the tourism, the urban tourism. So now we have large millions of people came to our cities, and so the empty houses that we have in the past, almost all the houses goes to local housing, for not local housing, local tourism, if you want. People can use this housing as a kind of hotel, so like Airbnb. So we feel some lack of housing, because the housing that we have in the past, now it's oriented to the tourism. So this is the first question, but it's very connected with the central city, Lisbon. And so a lot of people that in the past used this housing or normally used to afford this kind of buildings, homes, etc. Now they need to looking for housing in the suburbs. And this is the second thing. The suburbs have some capacity to receive more people, but now it's so large amount of people that seek for a housing. This is not easy. So the prices now are more high, and the problem it's now not only for Lisbon but also for the suburbs. This is another problem that we face today. And we have also some minorities, people that have, because in Europe we have the Erasmus program, because students from all Europe comes to all the countries, almost all the countries in Europe. And so we have a lot of students, so they need also to have some housing to live. And so the demand for housing, it's very high. And this is a problem that we face not only in the central city, but also in the suburbs. And when we have some crisis, this is a problem. And I want to reinforce the idea that with the COVID, the central government applies what we call, I don't know in English, but the moratoria, I don't know, but people don't need to pay at the end of the monthly their normal loans because some don't have any employment or have problems to pay their responsibilities, financial responsibilities. So our government stopped to or like very temporarily, but the people, the families don't need to pay anything to the bank in some time. Now they need to return to the normality, and this is a problem because the employment that we have in Portugal, it's more high, and we don't know what can be the problem only in the next months we can see, but this is a problem that maybe we can face in the future. And finally, for this topic that I want to reinforce also the idea that this is a very good conditions for the financing system, because they can support new buildings in the suburbs. They can pay for new buildings because they can wait for the new residents to pay the new loan. So the business of the financial sector remain the same and can be more important in the future because people need to have more space to live. So the real estate dynamic, it's increasing now with these problems that we are facing. And finally, the consequences also for the COVID that we can see in the demand of new housing. And it's true, maybe it's normally in all the world, every places in the world, but our institutions connected with real estate tell us that now people are looking for housing outside of the compact city, in the suburb, but not in the first ring of the suburbs, but more in the peri-urban areas or more far, in order to have like a single house, more space around the house, and good connections with their own organizations in order to can have another quality of life and working far from the organization. And so this brings also new problems also for the central city, because a lot of organizations are planning don't have all the workers now in the space, in the organizational space, because they don't need, because they see that they don't need to have all the people at the same time in the same building. So the challenge is also for the central cities to understand what can they do to this empty space that it's very obvious. We go face in the future with these empty buildings. And I don't know if I have time, but I just want to also comment one problem, one very deeply problem that we have also in the suburbs. In the metropolitan area of Lisbon, we have like 18 municipalities. So, but they work like 18 islands. And because they are island, they can resolve the problem of each island. So they can resolve the small problem of the public space. They can solve the problem for the basic education. They can solve the problem. But when we think about the metropolitan problems, they cannot solve the problem because they only see their own problem. And because we don't have the layer between the central government and the local government, these metropolitan problems, it's so difficult to solve in these conditions, because mayors only can resolve the problems where when they are or they agree together. Because if they don't agree all together, it's not possible to solve the problem. It's the problem with the transportation, metropolitan transportation, because it's so important for people. This is a very deeply problem that we have in the metropolitan area of Lisbon. The climate change, for example, or the to face the climate adaptation. So it's not possible to solve the problem with the some 18 kind of solutions. So we need to bring together all these mayors and these tools in order to have like a common solution for this intervention, but also for housing. And now Portugal and the rest of the countries in the European Union can use a large amount of money for their recovery plans. We have now what we call a recovery plan for the next 10 years around this. And this is a large amount of money. And one of the part of this.
So Jorge, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we're kind of at like 15 minutes right now. So so we should probably go to the next speaker. But I think that what you just said actually leads us in so many great directions. And I know that specifically your discussion of fragmentation, I'm sure really resonates with Paul and David in particular as they work within the Long Island environment. Okay. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to move to our next speaker, okay, but we can kind of come back around to the discussion of the federal policy when we come to Q&A. And I actually think that your discussion also leads very well into Murat's consideration of how COVID has affected the housing market in Toronto. So let me pass the mic to Murat. You can offer your comments.
So hi everyone from Toronto, and thanks a lot for this opportunity. So I was going to say one thing about what Jorge said actually about the governance in the municipalities of the periphery actually in Lisbon. So I think something similar is happening in Toronto too, in terms of governance, essentially in terms of regional governance and urban governance and suburban governance, because there is an ambiguity between the responsibilities and authorities actually here in Toronto too, essentially in the greater Toronto area. So I mean, I've been working on the housing market issues in the Greater Toronto area for a very long time. Before that, I was in Istanbul actually, so I came to Toronto to do my PhD, and then I started to work on the suburbanization actually in Toronto. But since then, it is something that I have been trying to figure out actually how this governance is working. There is still ambiguity on it, but still, there are many things to talk about it. So, but I can when I talk about Toronto suburbanization, this is somehow quite similar to American suburbanization, because Canada is in the North America, and they have a similar kind of suburbanization process since the 1940s and 50s. And it is, but the difference with Toronto is that, as a perception, there's a saying for Toronto, which I don't agree, but it's a common saying. People say that Toronto is Vienna surrounded by Phoenix. So it quite, I don't really agree with this, but it still shows the distinction between the central city of Toronto and the suburbs actually. So these are like two different words, but I can just say that the majority of population lives in the suburbs actually in Toronto, and and based on that, I can basically say that this is my PhD dissertation argument, and I've worked quite a very long time on the financialization of housing actually in Toronto and in Istanbul, and I also had some works in Frankfurt too. And what I can say is that in the case of Toronto is in the Greater Toronto area, so it is in southern Ontario. And the Greater Toronto area has a population of 7 million people, a little bit more than 7 million. And on the Ontario's total population is around 50 million. So half of people in the province, they live here. And it is the gravity center of economic activities actually in Ontario. So what I can say is that since the early 2000s, Toronto has been experiencing a housing crisis. Even though many people, they reside in the suburbs, there is now an ongoing housing crisis actually in the Greater Toronto area due to the fact that there is not enough housing supply. So this is one of the reasons, but there's also not enough skilled workers for construction sector. And in the meantime, there is not enough social and affordable rental housing actually. So, and one of the reasons for the existing housing crisis is that there is not enough options of housing. So what is happening in Toronto is actually what I can just describe it through this explanation that I actually developed in my PhD dissertation. Since the early 2000s, Ontario has embraced a new economic growth model, which is based on the financialization of housing. And Toronto, and also in Toronto, and also the Greater Toronto area, the suburban areas in the Greater Toronto area, they are the gravity center of this economic growth model in Ontario. So the financialization of housing is now the key engine, the locomotive of the economic growth actually in Ontario. So, and we can see it actually through analyzing the GDP of Ontario. The 20% of GDP of Ontario is produced by real estate and construction sectors. So they are the leading sectors right now. So, and also in the meantime, through immigration streams, and also through the internal immigration within Canada due to deindustrialization in many parts of the country. So Ontario is attracting many people, and those people usually they come to Toronto and the suburbs around Toronto. So that's why there is a need of accommodation, but there's not enough supply for it. Though that's why the housing prices are increasing day by day, and there is a housing crisis right now. But the fact that this growth model has been embraced actually in the early 2000s, and after that, actually a massive suburbanization, a new wave of suburbanization, I can call, after the 1950s and 60s. A new wave of suburbanization began in the Greater Toronto area, and also a policy change based on the privatization of housing, actually a market-oriented housing market began in the early 2000s, in the late 1990s and in the early 2000s. So as a result of this, we don't have adequate affordable rental housing market, actually. So, and we don't have adequate social housing systems. So almost 100,000 people are on the waiting list of social housing right now. And this is only for the city of Toronto, it is more actually for the suburbs. And what I can say is that the suburbanization has become an important fact to keep the Canadian economy and essentially the Ontario's economy going on. And until the COVID-19, until the breakout of the COVID-19, this was the main economic growth model, actually. So, and many immigrants, they came to Ontario. Actually, they ended up living in very poor conditions in the suburbs of Toronto. Actually, I conducted my fieldwork in Brampton, which is a suburban town in the Greater Toronto area, which is around 40 minutes away of Toronto by train. And Brampton is the suburban town which is considered to be the warehouse, the logistical center of the Greater Toronto area, where South Asian immigrants are living mainly. So whenever they come to Canada, they go to actually Brampton rather than going to Toronto to be close to their own communities, actually. So, but the problem is that many of them couldn't find an affordable housing options because the housing system does not offer them an affordable option. The housing system right now in the Greater Toronto is based on the expensive suburban houses, detached houses, actually. Usually you have to get a very expensive mortgage credits to buy that house, and it's very difficult for newcomers to get mortgage credit. They usually go to secondary mortgage lenders and so on. Or a massive condominium, a high-rise condominium buildings, actually, in downtown Toronto and in some parts of suburbs in the Greater Toronto area. And more actually high-rise condominium buildings are being built in the suburbs rather than detached houses, actually. So these are the two actually main dominant housing options in the Greater Toronto area, either suburban detached houses or high-rise condominium buildings. And these are all very expensive, actually, for newcomers and for immigrants. And that's why we have been experiencing a housing crisis right now. And I could just refer to the well-known work of Harvey Molosh and about the growth machine theory, and there is an existing growth coalition, actually, in the Greater Toronto area. Developers and financial institutions and real estate investment trusts, they are actually forming a kind of coalition to keep the housing prices as high as possible due to the fact that the mortgage credits are being marketed in the global financial markets by using the mortgage based securities. And for this very reason, I can say that the ongoing housing crisis stems from the economic growth model that's based on the financialization of housing. And with the COVID-19, what we saw actually in the beginning, the house prices a little bit decreased, but later on, the government in Ontario and also the government in Canada, they just realized that, okay, this was our, growth model. So we have to do something for it. So they just, declined the interest rates and then started to distribute very cheap mortgage credits actually. So, and what happened actually, nowadays, the housing prices are much more expensive than the time before the COVID. So, and then the housing market has become much more unaffordable. And many people, they want to go to suburbs right now instead of living in tiny condos, because as we know that people need larger spaces because of the practice of work from home. So for this very reason, the house prices continue to increase and the affordability crisis continues to deepen. And what I can say finally is that there is a recent survey about it. 54% of young people in Toronto, young couples in Toronto, sorry, in Ontario, they want to leave the province actually to live in a more affordable space, in a more affordable, what can I say, city or like a town. That is what I can say for now. So as a summary, I can say that there is the economic growth model in Ontario actually failed to provide an affordable housing system to people. So, and COVID-19 revealed this failure, I can say. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, definitely some international resonances with the U.S. and with Long Island specifically. Okay, next, Willow Lungamam.
Thank you, Chris. So nice to join you from Washington, D.C. Such interesting presentation so far. So I guess I'm bringing it home to U.S., but not quite New York quite yet. But I'm gonna, in my brief comments, just try to respond to some of the questions that Dr. Neat has posed to us and do so through some of my current work on suburban redevelopment in the Washington, D.C. suburbs and my role as director of a new project at the University of Maryland on small business displacement. So my current book project is really looking at the intersection around some of the trends we're seeing in suburban redevelopment, retrofitting, smart growth, those things that are trying to make the suburbs more walkable, more urban-like, more transit-oriented, which I think most of us see as positive trends in suburbs. But at the same time, that intersecting with what we know of the changing demographics of suburbs. We have the majority of immigrants in the US, majority of people of color in the US, and the majority of individuals living in poverty are all living in suburbs. And the places that we've most targeted for redevelopment are often those communities that those groups are living in. Those groups tend to locate into the inner ring, where we have had decades of quote unquote suburban decline, which is actually active disinvestment of those places, active white flight, active commercial disinvestment, and active policies of commercial redlining and other policies that have made these places, the infrastructure of these places, in some ways unsustainable and in need of reinvestment. And so what we're seeing right now is that those places are beginning to get some of that reinvestment that they have been starved of for decades, right? And then those communities that have located there, have kept the communities afloat, have invested their own dollars in maintaining the small businesses and housing that has been in decline for decades, are now being pushed out of those communities by reinvestment policies. And so the project is really looking at the ways in which communities are trying to fight back, trying to organize, and to promote more equitable development policies in these communities. And so some of the lessons that, I think I can take, at least from my own work, is that, there's been a host of government policies that have really incentivized the private market to invest, right? It is no coincidence in terms of the communities that are redeveloping. It is very similar to gentrification in the city, in that, government policy is deeply intertwined with the kind of new investment that we see in the private market, but also the people movement, right? We know that capital moves oftentimes before people, and I would say that policy moves even before capital, right? So what are the underlying policies? And this gets to a question that Dr. Need asked us about the role of government. So in many of these places, there are enterprise zones, there's the government use of eminent domain, parcel assemblage, upzoning, new TOD zoning, new infrastructure investments in the form of new light rail investments, for instance, on the Purple Line, which is one of the areas that I've centered a lot of my work. New marketing and new investments in new sidewalks and other kinds of investments that have made these places more desirable, more safe for new investment, and have really incentivized that and have been really a giveaway to suburban developers and to new residents that are seeking to locate there, but are not tied to robust protections for existing residents and for small businesses and cultural institutions and community institutions and the like, who tend to face the impact of these developments, right? So another question that Dr. Need asked us are who are most harmed, right, by some of these policies. And it's the obvious candidates who are most vulnerable in the first place: immigrants, renters, families, low-income families, small businesses, especially those owned by immigrants and people of color, cultural institutions, and the vital supports for these communities. And these things are linked, right? Because if small businesses leave communities, then the residents who live there are much more likely to not feel that this community belongs to them. And many of the communities that I have worked in for this book project, these are communities that explicitly located into these communities before the affordable housing and the affordable commercial spaces, but also for the cultural institutions that exist there, the immigrant serving institutions, the small businesses that serve products from their hometowns, right? The fact that people speak their language. And so they have done so. And if those institutions, if those small businesses are forced out, then residents also have less incentive to stay in those communities. And so some of the questions are, how are communities actually struggling to fight back? How are they struggling to stay in place in suburbs? And what are some of the constraints to that organizing? Those are also questions that Dr. Neat kind of posed to us. And so, in my experience, organizing is really struggling in suburbs. There's not a lot of capacity for organizing, both from the grassroots to the grass tops. And what I mean by the grassroots are the kind of civic infrastructure that we might see in cities that have been built over decades, the kind of community and cultural institutions that serve not as only vital service providing institutions, but also organizing. And many of these places are just getting started in many suburbs, as we've seen this massive push of communities and pull of communities to the suburbs. Then we've also seen that, the cultural and community institutions are sort of following behind, right? You see a large immigrant community move to the suburbs, but the main base of the immigrant community has traditionally been in the city. And then you have immigrant serving institutions maybe starting a new satellite office in a suburb in order to sort of reach those immigrants. Well, that's only one or two people where their main headquarters had several, right? And so there's a lack of capacity there. There's a need to sort of serve large populations, much more diverse populations across larger areas. And so there's just not a lot of capacity there. And oftentimes there's sort of one of a few organizations that are there. And they're struggling to do so much. And then the tenants and the businesses themselves are not organized. In many cities, we have tenants organization, we have many small business associations, really established infrastructure that allows communities to easily tap in. And we don't have that in many suburban communities. We also don't have many policy tools. We don't have inclusionary zoning. We don't have a robust framework around tenants' rights. We don't have a lot of the same tools that we have built over decades of struggle in the cities and suburbs. And so we're struggling now to build those for the first time. And then we also lack political representation and power for many of these communities. In many of the communities that I am working in, you have many of the first, right? The first immigrant elected to a county council, the first one to serve in this role, and they're pushing for new tools and policies, but they do so in an environment, and I think we've, Marat brought up this point about sort of fragmentation, but the fragmentation really affects what can be done in any particular suburb, and even the visibility to the issues, right? I mean, you have suburban organizing happening in this suburb, but it's disconnected from what's happening in another suburb. So you have organizations that are trying to build robust coalitions in order to help increase their capacity, but there's very little sense that what happens in this place matters to the other communities, and so it makes for very difficult organizing. So, what are some of the strategies that are working? I would say, communities are really just trying to build the toolkit, one policy at a time. They're trying to fight for more comprehensive protections, but oftentimes they sort of get piecemeal protections. So a comprehensive, equitable development platform, might take the place of in terms of a community benefits agreement that addresses affordable housing, small business protections, community amenities, and so forth. But in all the communities in which I've seen, those efforts have failed. And so you might get a small business protection here or there. But some of the things that I think these groups are really learning is to start early and to build the coalitions and the capacity that allow them to have that more robust conversation, and to tap the capacity of cities and these organizations in which a lot of these organizations have started from, and other kinds of intermediary organizations that can help bridge the gap between different kinds of suburbs and can also help fill the gap in terms of capacity. So the other question around COVID, how has COVID really affected these suburbs? I mean, some of the communities that I have been in have been hardest hit by COVID. These are one particular community in which I work, Langley Park, which is just beyond the University of Maryland, was one of the hardest hit communities in Maryland. Has many essential workers, many undocumented workers, people without insurance, overcrowded housing conditions, and all of that contributed to very high rates of infection. In addition, there were already gentrification pressures in this community, and those have not gone away during COVID. And I think we're seeing that in many places, is where I was saying it's not just the city, but it's also the suburbs that have had these pressures beforehand and have continued to see those pressures. And so we're seeing high rates of eviction. In Langley Park, they just had a renter strike where they were not only fighting the poor conditions in housing, the lack of investment, but also the corporatization of housing and the fact that there were evictions happening both during and post-moratorium in Langley Park, and lots of other ways in which organizing is trying to bring visibility to the issue and are utilizing the media and even legal means in order to be able to stay in place. I'm at time, so I won't continue with the small business discussion, but I'll be happy to talk about small businesses later in terms of how small businesses have been affected and how, especially during COVID and in suburbs in particular.
Great, thank you so much. And I think that those comments are a perfect segue into our conversation with David Garton and Paul Gibson. And I guess I would, Professor Lungamam spoke a lot about the kind of equity concerns, the danger of gentrification and displacement. And I know that both David Garton and Paul Gibson have been trying to work together to figure out ways that a development within Uniondale might produce community benefits for local residents. The folks who, as Willow Langamam just mentioned, really haven't, both residents and businesses that have invested, not just not just financially in neighborhoods, but also socially, emotionally, culturally, right, in these neighborhoods, and ways of ensuring that longtime residents and longtime business owners also benefit from new development. So maybe if I could turn first to David, could you talk a little bit and maybe give a brief overview of the hub development, what RXR is planning at the hub for those who are not from the area, and then talk a little bit about how RXR has kind of taken steps to try to develop maybe more equitable forms of development than we've seen elsewhere in the on Long Island or in the New York metropolitan region.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for having me. And one thing that I couldn't help but take note, whether it's Lisbon, Toronto, or DC, a lot of the challenges are universal, right? So a lot of the challenges that we're facing here, I don't know if it's, comforting, but it's good to hear in terms of what you all have learned and also maybe best practices. So as Chris pointed out, RXR is a regional developer. We have a pretty broad footprint from Westchester County to Long Island to the New York City itself. And instead of thinking of all of these as sort of separate entities, our view of the world instead of a superstar city is superstar regions, right? And just to be perfectly honest, New York City is the center of the universe of our region, right? And the key is how do the suburbs around that universe leverage New York City's success. And there's a few things that we have going for us, Chris, as you pointed out, the sort of the doom and gloom of a year ago, like New York City's over, office buildings are done, and the thing of the past, everybody's going to work remotely. And Brian Chesky talking about how now people are going to live in another country every month to work remotely. Some people may be able to do that. That's great. But New York City, look, the majority of the moves earlier in the pandemic was moves to storage, and people have been coming back. In June of this year, we actually had a record number of leases signed in the city for the first time since we started tracking it in 2008. Luxury home sales are at a record, and we still have a quarter to go. So I say that, and I preface my comments in terms of sort of how we view the suburbs, and particularly in the Nassau Hub in particular, is New York City at the end of the day continues to retain its title as sort of the world's capital for talent. As Google if you all didn't see this, Google just announced it's making a $2 billion commitment for a new office building in the center of Manhattan. So the world's one of the most successful companies in the world is committed, as well as others. So the challenge for our region and in suburbs of like nature of how do you capitalize on the success of that economic generator that is the largest economic generator in our country. And Nassau County and Hempstead and Uniondale have a number of inherent strengths in order to be able to capitalize on this, right? Which is really, really, really important as we're talking about equitable development, right? Great mass transit in the form of Long Island Railroad, strong educational institutions like Hofstra, a growing population, which is we just saw from the latest census, is that this region continues to grow. Before I jumped on here, I just did a quick back of the math sort of calculation on looking at the 2020 census. Hempstead's population grew by 9.7%. Excuse me, the town grew by 4.4%. The housing stock, though, between 2010 and 2020 only grew by 1.4%. Now, that's not a one-to-one ratio, but there's more people coming to the town. We're still not building enough housing. Same thing applies with the village of Hempstead, which is another area of an underserved area of Nassau County, which the population grew from 9.79% but the housing stock only grew about 5%. Again, it's not a one-to-one ratio. Need to dive into the data a little bit more, but at the end of the day, more people want to come here. Good thing, good problem to have, particularly immigrants. As you look at the history of the city of New York, immigrants really buoyed the city, particularly from the late 90s to the late 2010s. So you have these different strengths, but what we're finding is we don't have enough housing supply. And we have all these structural shifts that are taking place. And the challenge that for developers like us, and I see a couple of people on the call, Janine and obviously Paul, and I work together on how we develop and create this development that's called the Nassau Hub. And for those that aren't familiar, the Nassau Hub, if you may be familiar with the Nassau Coliseum, it's been featured in a number of different concerts throughout history. And there's about 72 acres of vacant parking lots that are literally doing nothing right now, like nothing. Now, people have tried to develop these parking lots for quite some time, and this is just a very specific project. And as Chris pointed out, this is a project that we're working on. And also, what I like to say, and Janine and Paul have heard me say repeatedly, I just gave you all the stats in terms of the housing and the housing stock. While this is a great project, it's only zoned for 500 residential units. So at the end of the day, no matter how great this project we want to tout, it's not going to solve all of the housing challenges that we have. But maybe, Willow, to your point, yes, there are siloed organizational efforts, suburbs, cities, different towns, et cetera. Ideally, what we're trying to do is trying to make this bit of a model that could be replicated. 500 residential units. We want to have a substantial amount of experiential retail, new parking that's going to complement the Coliseum. It's going to have on top of a parking garage of a urban garden, trying to incorporate and infuse as many sustainability measures as possible. And I can go into the details more about the project itself, but what I'm saying is we are trying to co-create this project. And this is really hard because I have multiple communities that surround the Nassau Hub. And for those who aren't familiar with Nassau County, I've got Uniondale, I've got Garden City, I got East Meadow, I got a number of other communities. All of them have a lot of opinions. And we talk about of community engagement and making people feel that they're included and that they're part of their process. I mean, if we did an exercise right now on where should we all go to lunch right now, it would take us forever to try and figure out where we should go to lunch. Now we're actually trying to figure out how to develop 72 acres. But we're working with the town, we're working with the county, and our role as developer, we're trying to be very transparent on what we can and cannot do, but to be perfectly honest, at the end of the day, we have a certain amount of investment that investors that entrust us with their investment, and they're seeking a certain return. There's a certain amount of product that we need to put out there in terms of getting that return. How do we make sure that the county benefits from its investment into our development? How do we make sure the town gets what it's looking for in terms of its development? And then there's the broader community in which we have to make sure that there's people that are hired locally, which means I'm going to have another conversation with the building trades, which is very difficult to have, but it's a worthwhile and an important conversation. Then there's the conversation that we're going to have with small businesses, in which, yes, we should figure out small business protections, but have we seen through this sort of pandemic, there are probably some small businesses that are not going to make it. There are some large businesses that are not going to make it. But how do we help either we support or through our development or working with government to help those burgeoning business owners and entrepreneurs that have that really good idea that may not have the capital, social capital, the financial wherewithal or what have you to grow that business. That is sort of the vision that what we'd like to do at the development site itself. But then it's also not a panacea. And this is where, again, I want Paul to jump in, because obviously I'm speaking from the developer perspective. But our approach to many of these types of developments is trying to seek, again, what the community is looking for, be transparent on what we can and cannot do, and then figure out what that formula is that's going to have to be tweaked repeatedly. Because as we've seen over the past 18 months, a number of structural shifts has happened, and I'm probably going to I'll probably get a few things wrong in our development. How do we actually revisit it and make sure we try and get it right? So I've said a lot. I'd love to have more of a conversation, but Paul, I don't know if there's anything that you would like to add.
Oh, absolutely, David.
Good.
I
I
set it up.
figured as much.
Yeah, you know, I gave you the floor for a little bit, and I appreciate the fact that you're giving it to me, but I think this is a conversation that we can both have with our audience.
Yep.
From the community's perspective, I think RXR has done a phenomenal job of engaging us at the start of the project, and it looks a lot different than what we've seen in other examples of developments throughout the country and throughout the world. I think that this is a model that will be successful going forward, and I commend RXR for the way that they've engaged the community, and I'll describe it in just a second, in terms of dedicating time and resources to understand what the community desires are, what the community needs are, and at the same time being, as he mentioned, transparent with what the impact of the project will be. And the idea of starting out that way, asking questions, providing information, working with the community to solve some of the concerns that may be coming up as a result of the development without knowing what it is, has I think paid off in the long run. Just a little bit about UCLT and our community of the hamlet of Uniondale. We are not for profit 501c3. We actually are an outgrowth of an organization with several partners, including Hofstra University, called the Greater Uniondale Area Action Coalition. Its roots start back in 2010. It was developed as a result of a challenge or a charge to develop a community development plan, also to react to what was going on in terms of the economy, and try and find the common concerns, issues that all of the community could rally behind and support and advocate for. So you have 26 organizations, community organizations, including the fire department, the library, the Board of Education, 3 or 4 civic groups, youth groups, all coming together with Hofstra as one of our main partners that actually collected our community in one spot, and through a series of meetings, filtering out what the concerns would be, what are the things we should advocate for, and then making sure that we all understand exactly what we believe are priorities, and then developing campaigns to get these priorities done, one of which is housing. So as a result of the housing crisis that was going on, we recognized that the Uniondale area, the area in Nassau color referred to as the corridor of color, had been targeted for predator lending and was suffering as a result of the impact of the recession. More so disproportionately than, let's put it this way. New York State had a disproportionate number of foreclosures and pre-foreclosures compared to the rest of the country as a result of the recession. Long Island had a disproportionate circumstance compared to the rest of New York State. The corridor of color had the disproportionately high incident compared to all of Long Island. So you can see how this just basically drilled down to our area being affected. And the coalition of organizations getting together formed the Uniondale Community Land Trust. And the land trust model was not necessarily something that we discovered on our own, but we actually looked at the circumstances with the blighted and foreclosed homes around us, and went looking on a search nationwide to find what was the model that would make sense. And we came up with the community land trust model, which briefly is a shared equity model that assures affordable housing, converting these blighted homes into affordable housing. And the way that it's affordable is simply by selling the structure that's been renovated and keeping the land in the trust. So by definition, you're getting a reduction in price. But affordable housing was the answer that we felt would achieve two goals. One, bring stability to the community, address the issue of housing, and at the same time, convert these homes back into tax-paying structures. So let's take a step back now and go back to the work that we're doing with RXR and the Hub. RXR came into our community and said, we're about to do this development. We were braced for the impact of that. We understand that with the increase, the economic benefit to the community, which we are embracing, there would be adverse impacts that we need to make sure we mitigate. We've worked with RXR and with our local government to identify what we believe to be those areas of concern and to find ways to address those areas of concern, not by just reaching into RXR's pocket and asking them to pay for it, but to work together to determine where we can find the resources to address those areas of concern and focus those resources on mitigating those problems that we would anticipate. I think the process was disrupted with COVID, but in the essence of it, it took, what, a year, David, from the beginning, and we're still doing it.
Yep.
And I think at this point, there are three outcomes that I want to highlight, and then we can talk about the roles that we all play. One, bringing information to our community quelled all concerns in terms of misinformation going around. That's first. Second, we understand that RXR is not going to be able to pay for all of the things that we need to have happen as a result of the fact that we are going to be impacted by this development. But the idea that we can sit in a room and determine what they will be, and then figure out ways to find those resources, whether they be government, whether they be privately funded, whether they be funded by RXR, whether they be funded by looking at what's going on in the community and redirecting resources, has been beneficial. And then the third thing I want to say is, whereas you may read in the paper, see in media, where communities have an uprise with a concern of development that goes on in their community, we believe that we understand, and as a result, we believe that we are working with RXR as we go down this path, and that we are going to expend our energies not so much on protecting ourselves, we do trust and verify, but working with the developer, with local government to try and get the best outcome that we can in this community. And that, I think, has been a useful time and energy that moves us in the right direction.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I mean, yeah, we've been doing it over a year, and I guess the point that I want to make is there really is no endpoint, right? I'm anxious to see a shovel in the ground, which I think leading up to this, we're in a very good place. But then suddenly, when construction happens and traffic inevitably starts to rise, or people start to see cranes, they're going to be really angry about this development. So it is that type of ongoing communication that we need to continue to have, not only through the construction itself, but through the operations. As I said, we need to continue to revisit it. And then one of the comments that I believe Willow talked about in terms of CBAs, and we do have a CBA with the Nassau Hub project. But in my experience, one of the things that I've been very frustrated about, and it's moving forward on a project in New York City, different parts of the city is very different than moving parts of the suburbs, different issues, different challenges. And while I think CBAs have a role, I think there's also an element where there's an expectation where the private sector isn't expected to address some ways, many institutional and structural issues, be it education systems, underlying infrastructure like sewage, et cetera, which I get it, because if the development itself is the target, it makes it really easy to organize against. But sometimes instead of trying to, I don't know what the answer is, instead of impeding or preventing a project moving forward, ideally we have a world where we are working from the community, the private sector, and the public sector of figuring out, okay, what is the true inclusive growth? If you have an environment that is safe, that does have the ability for people to participate in, a market-based economy, to have upward mobility, and then what is the role that government should have in terms of there's appropriate guidelines and public protections, but also doing their role of making sure that the services that they provide, and this is one of the things I'm really hopeful with, particularly with all the federal funding that has taken place with COVID, is you have a lot of resources that have come to municipalities that I think there's an opportunity to address a number of those structural issues without putting too much weight on the private sector. Not that the private sector doesn't play a role, but I think there's a holistic approach on how we think about when it comes to inclusive growth. I've said a lot, Christopher. I don't know if people have questions, but
could I take a moment to react to that just a second, if I could?
Yeah, please.
I spent the beginning of my presentation applauding the work that RXR has done and how you've basically broken the mold from what people perceive to be the typical action-reaction kind of circumstance that happens with the new development coming into town. And you deserve it. At the same time, there are things that we need to make sure occur in terms of your role as a developer, in terms of your role as a liaison with our local government and a liaison with the community, that need to make sure that once we establish, once the development is there, it's not forgotten. And
yep.
Let me kind of lay them out. You agree, we agree that you aren't the panacea. You can't possibly be the panacea, but at the same time, you have to admit that you will have the impact in the community. Uniondale is braced for the impact, positive and negative. And we look forward to making sure that, and you've committed to making sure that there's a conversation that speaks not only to the anticipated, but the unanticipated consequences or impacts that the development will have. And to the extent that we can work together to get these things done, we will. We would look to make sure that, as an example, if the hub has the unintended consequence of increasing traffic, there's a role there for you to analyze it and work with and bring it to the attention of our local government so that we can mitigate that impact. We look forward to not only having a conversation that has happened from the time that you decided that you wanted to come into the community to the time that you build, but the time after you've built, throughout the relation, throughout and going forward, to make sure that you are a good neighbor and a good partner with us and we with you.
Yeah, no, look, I think when it comes to development, one thing just to add, and I do want to open up the floor. I think Janine and Paul and those who've been involved in this process have been very adamant that last thing I want to do is try and tell y'all what you want to hear, because I think that is if we consider ourselves a long-term investor, trying just getting through the approval process hurts us in the long run if we are disingenuous. And so I think, Paul, what you're describing is not only that active communication, but also holding each other accountable, which again has to be integral when it comes to development.
Fair enough. My hat is affordable housing, and I'll end with this because I know we do want to have some time for questions and answers. But my hat I wear is affordable housing. Long Island, ironically, Uniondale is located right next to Levittown, which was the model for suburban development, but also the model for minority exclusion. Long Island has, Uniondale has, and the Corridor of Color, without a doubt, has addressed these issues in terms of laws, but it took an expose of Newsday back in 2018 to determine that just because the laws are in place, that doesn't mean the practices are fair. And we can talk about that later on, but I guess the point I'm raising is that as a developer with other developers, we're looking for affordable housing to continue, not to be integrated into the work that you do, and you've committed to that. We need some help in making sure that the government enforces the fair housing requirements that are necessary for developers. And we're leaning on them to kind of make sure that that happens. And we could look for support there. And we also want to make sure that that even though we're putting up 500 units, it does serve as an example and a model for other developers to come into the community. And we're looking for you to kind of make sure to lead the way by example that affordable housing is a consideration that's made for developments going forward.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right, so a great conversation, and Rosemary Clipper has been waiting very patiently for about 15 minutes to ask a question. So Rosemary, would you like to ask your question of the panel? You're muted. I may need to. Are you?
Yes,
able to?
thank you.
Okay, there we go.
Just with the first presentation, I don't know if there's an answer. It's something that we all struggle with. It's really with having so many municipalities. Sometimes it's great to have local control and so forth, but to really, how do you build that network? You know the issues that you're facing, but to really bring the proper partners around the table and to just really encourage the type of partnership that, private industry has with their government leaders and so forth, because we really can't do it alone and the problems are just becoming bigger. Thank you.
Great question. Do our panelists want to respond to that? This issue of fragmentation and the challenges of fragmentation cut across many of the panelists' comments today. Would anyone like to speak to the potential solutions or ways of moving beyond fragmentation towards more comprehensive regional approaches?
I can say a little word about that. Normally, people coming to around the table to discussing the problem, but they don't agree at the end because because they can forget that they are responsible for their community. So they don't want to participate in a solution where their own communities can be not so positively affected. So this is a problem. The second is the second step, if you want. So if they cannot access to a solution, we have some regional and metropolitan agencies that can promote like a kind of more consensus around the project, but it's not easy. And at the end, we have the government, the central government that impose their solution. An example is for, I can give you, it's for the new airport of Lisbon. Since 1950, we are looking for a good location for our important new airport. And until now, the airport, like I don't remember, 5 or 6 locations, and until now it's not possible to find a final decision because we have different perspectives from the NGOs organizations or from the municipalities or from, I don't know. So it's so difficult, and at the end, we don't have any solution, what is very, very problematic, if you want. The second, just to finish, is it's about the discussion that we hear. It's a very good discussion. And in Portugal and in Lisbon, it's also interesting to see that the central capital starting to have like a new project, and normally the other municipalities following this project. For example, for the affordable housing, we have two main directions taking for Lisbon. One is using the empty public houses and public buildings that we have in the city to solve some part of this problem of lack of housing. So transforming these kind of buildings, office buildings, but public service buildings, etc., empty in affordable housing. This is one the directions for the solution. The second is to join private sector and public sector, local administration, of course, in order to give to the private sector some municipal housing that are not in good conditions, but the public sector can renovate this housing, and in some conditions that can put them in the market again, and they can explore this housing in 20 or 30 years. At the end, the housing returned to the municipality. So this is the beginning, and some of others municipalities following these examples. It's not amazing that they don't have amazing results, but this is a beginning in the starting of a solution, not a solution, but a contribution for a solution of this big problem that we have in our cities, suburbs, and etc.
Go ahead, Willow.
Yeah, I just want to say that, in our region, we do have a Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments that is supposed to coordinate amongst different municipalities across the region. They largely play the coordination and data sharing role, but they do have some role in transportation policy and more shared environmental concerns, but have struggled on issues like housing to really make progress around fair share housing and other issues that would cross municipal lines. But there has been more progress through some voluntary cooperation amongst those. So there is the role of the existing regional organizations, but they have to be given like power, to actually enforce and to adopt policy at that level. But also the role of the states. California is a great example of where the state has really played a major role in requiring regional cooperation on housing. There's also the role of philanthropy in our area. The foundations have really garnered some important contributions in bringing the business community in particular to funding issues of housing at the regional level, and the private sector. So we have in the Washington, D.C. area, the Greater Washington Partnership that has an inclusive growth plan and is really taking the big developers and asking them, how are they supporting inclusive growth? And then finally, I'll say the grassroots, because I am part of the Purple Line Corridor Coalition that is working on coordination between Montgomery County and Prince George's County for the most vulnerable and impacted communities along that line, which happen to sit at the intersection of these two counties. And so we're bringing the counties together to adopt shared policies. When you have one side of the street with an inclusionary zoning policy and the other side of the street without, how do you coordinate to make sure that those communities are staying in place? So they're advocates, but they're also coordinators for those shared goals and policies.
Excellent. I think that's we probably have to end there because we're at that time, but that's a very hopeful note to end the panel on. And I want to thank all of our panelists. People can join me in thanking them with emoji claps or whatever we do now on Zoom. for joining us. I think we had a great conversation, despite the fact that we had participants from around the world and around the U.S. I think that there were so many common themes that emerged, and hopefully this is the beginning of a much longer conversation. Again, thank you all to all the members of the audience who joined us, and we'll be seeing some of you later on today at 2:40 for our panel on fair and affordable housing. For any of you who didn't have a chance to register for the afternoon panel, know that it's also going to be recorded like this one, and it'll be available on Hofstra's YouTube channel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks you all.
So much.